I will respect the privacy of my patients, for their problems are not disclosed to me that the world may know. Most especially must I tread with care in matters of life and death. If it is given to me to save a life, all thanks. But it may also be within my power to take a life. This awesome responsibility must be faced with my great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty. Above all, I must not play at God. This oath is spoken by many doctors as they are trusted to treat illnesses and save lives. However, what happens when your doctor gets a thrill out of killing? This is the true crime story of Dr. Harold Shipman, AKA the Doctor of Death. Today I'm drinking gin, and it's like Christmas in a cup, so cheers. Sorry to anyone that was looking for a video last week. I actually had a wedding to go to during the weekend, which is when I usually film. I was a groomsman, and this was a longtime buddy from high school, and we all, basically a bunch of my high school buddies were groomsmen as well, and we don't get together very often, so we were out having a lot of fun Friday and Saturday of last weekend. I didn't have a voice. We went out Friday night and had some drinks and had a lot of fun, and then woke up super early on Saturday to go golfing, of course, because what else would you do after a night of drinking? And we just by the end of Saturday, I could not even talk. My voice was just completely gone. So I had to postpone for a week, but thank you all for tuning in. And if you haven't seen my show before, I'm going to have a few drinks, and we are going to talk about Harold Shipman, the Doctor of Death, today. So let's get started. Harold Shipman was born on January 14th of 1946 in Nottingham. He was the second of three children to his father Harold Shipman and his mother Vera Britton. Harold grew up in a Methodist household and enjoyed playing rugby when he was little. He was like any other young boy. He grew up and developed a very strong relationship with his mother. When Harold was 17, his mother Vera was diagnosed with lung cancer. As the lung cancer progressed, a doctor would actually stop by the house and administer morphine to his mother to keep her comfortable. As the doctor administered the morphine, Harold was looking on, and every time this happened, he noticed that his mother was instantly pain-free and she was very comfortable. This fascinated Harold and would later play a huge role in the way Harold treated his victims. Harold's mother passed away on June 21st, 1963. Her passing was super hard for Harold. He internalized all of his feelings and would never really discuss what the passing of his mother meant to him. It was something that was brewing and waiting to explode. Harold Shipman married Primrose Oxtoby in 1966. They went on to have 4 children together. After Harold graduated grade school, he went on to study medicine at Leeds University. He graduated in 1970. In 1974, Harold took his first position as a general practitioner. He worked at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in Todmorden. That is a mouthful. And I don't think I pronounced it right, so kudos to me. That's where Harold had his first run-in with the law. Harold was caught forging prescriptions of pethidine for his own personal use. Pethidine was essentially an opiate that was similar to morphine. After being caught forging prescriptions, he was fined £600 and was sent to a drug rehabilitation center in York. It was determined by the police and the medical board that even though he had a drug problem, that it didn't actually affect any of his patients. So they allowed Harold to continue to practice medicine. After this brief run-in with the law, he actually became a very well-known practitioner in the Donnybrook Medical Center for 14 years. In 1992, Harold Shipman had a very thriving business at the Donnybrook Medical Center. There were a lot of things that Harold didn't agree with at the hospital, one of them being the technology that they were using, and also some of the bookkeeping that they were doing. So he actually decided to create his own practice and move out of the Donnybrook Medical Center. What really hurt the medical center was Harold was one of their biggest practitioners. He had one of the largest client lists, and he took them all with them. So There were some legal actions that were trying to be taken, and a lot of things fell through, and Harold Shipman was able to create his own practice and move out of the Donnybrook Medical Center. It actually became known after the fact that a lot of his relationships at the medical center were deteriorating fast, and that probably played a big role into him getting out and starting his own practice. With his new practice open, he actually became a very prominent figure in the community. For the next 6 years, his practice flourished. There was a wait list to get him as a doctor. One of the biggest things that people loved about him was he would actually make house calls. So he would go out to your house to see you and treat you right there. His client base was made up mostly of elderly patients, which is probably another reason why people love that he actually made house calls, because once you get older, it might be hard to get out of the house. You might need assistance. And having the ability for your doctor to actually come into your house is a huge benefit. He quickly became known as the best doctor in the area. In March of 1998, the Hyde community where Harold Shipman had his practice started to become concerned that some of his patients were dying in very curious circumstances. A lot of these circumstances were very similar to one another, so it started raising some red flags. Dr. Reynolds, who was a partner at a nearby practice, started doing a little digging. She actually alerted the local coroner, John Pollard, that some of the deaths seen by Harold Shipman were just well above the average for what doctors were treating. Most doctors did not have that high of a death rate, so she was very concerned and wanted to touch base with the coroner to see if she could dig up any information about Harold Shipman. She also asked the coroner to look at the high cremation rate for elderly women that Harold Shipman had. All of the forms for a cremation had to be countersigned, and somehow Harold Shipman was able to get them all countersigned, which is very unusual. John Pollard, the local coroner, actually asked for a police investigation and got the local health authority involved as well. Local health authority investigator David Smith got involved, looked through all of the evidence, and said that there was nothing of concern there. There was no further actions taken. They wrote it off as Harold Shipman had a large patient list of mostly elderly people, so his death rate was normal because he was dealing with elderly people. The local investigation was tossed aside because there just wasn't enough evidence to charge Harold Shipman with anything. That is, until Kathleen Grundy, age 81, unexpectedly passed away after a visit from Harold Shipman. Harold made a routine house call to Kathleen Grundy on June 24th of 1998. Kathleen was in tremendous shape. She actually was very physical. She had no health concerns whatsoever and was just a super healthy 81-year-old. After the visit from Dr. Harold Shipman, she unexpectedly passed away, and it was a huge surprise to her whole family. Harold marked the cause of death on the death certificate as natural causes. Kathleen Grundy had a daughter named Angela Woodruff. Kathleen Grundy in 1986 asked her daughter Angela, the lawyer, to write a will giving Angela her whole estate. The estate was very large, and Angela was the sole beneficiary of it. Angela, being a lawyer, had no problems doing that for her mother. Following Kathleen's death, Angela was made aware that her mother actually made out a different will. This will made Harold Shipman the sole beneficiary of her large estate. The will was much newer than the will that she filled out for her mother in 1986. It was dated June 9th of 1998. Just 15 days before her death. The will was also signed by Kathleen Grundy, her mother. Angela was immediately suspicious of the new will because she had a great relationship with her mother and knew that her mother would come to her for any legal advice, and if she wanted to change the will, Angela would have been able to do it for free for her, and it would have been an easy change. She also knew that her mother would have never signed her whole estate over to her doctor. Angela's suspicions were actually authenticated when she tracked down the witnesses that signed the will. These witnesses had no clue that they actually signed any paperwork. They were very confused to hear that they had signed their names to a will, especially for a will that didn't belong to them. Maybe one more. Christmas in a cup. If you've never had gin before, It tastes like pine needles, which is actually pretty refreshing. Knowing that the witnesses that signed her mother's will didn't have anything to do with it, this was all the information that she needed. Angela immediately reported this to the police. The police immediately realized that Dr. Harold Shipman, the name who was on the will, was the same doctor that they just investigated a couple months prior for the same thing of suspicious deaths and all of the cremation requests. Investigators asked Angela if they could exhume her mother's body. Obviously, she agreed, and they did. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed on August 1st of 1998. The same day that they exhumed Kathleen's body, they also got search warrants to search Harold Shipman's doctor's office and his house. During the searches of his doctor's office, they found a typewriter and they seized Kathleen's medical records. As all of this evidence was seized, the investigation was turned over to senior investigators and was classified as a major incident. A toxicology report was finalized on Kathleen's body on August 14th. The toxicology report came back positive for opiates, most likely morphine. The initial toxicology report didn't show how much morphine was actually in her body, so they had to order another test. While this other toxicology report was being done, investigators decided to go through 19 deaths that were actually investigated months prior to see if there was anything else that they could pull up. If you recall, the investigation a couple months prior to this stated that there was no evidence of any wrongdoing by Harold Shipman. Investigators now went back to those deaths and started looking a little closer. They started asking questions to all the family members. They wanted to know if those family members had any concerns about their loved ones' deaths. Any more drink? The investigation continued to widen as more and more deaths were uncovered that were just kind of unusual and had weird circumstances behind them. On August 26th, a forensic document examiner concluded that the will from Kathleen Grundy was actually forged. He said the forgery was most likely written with a typewriter. After doing a little bit of investigating, it was concluded that it was the exact same typewriter that they pulled from Harold Shipman's office. 2 days after that, investigators were informed that the level of morphine in Kathleen Grundy's body was enough to kill her. They now had enough evidence to change her cause of death to homicide. On August 7th, 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. He was also arrested for forging the will. This wasn't the end of the investigation. Investigators were still combing through case by case of everyone that Harold Shipman had seen. They actually started to exhume a ton of bodies. From September of 1998 to February of 1999, they exhumed 7 bodies. Every single one of those bodies was found to have a lethal dose of morphine. This gave them enough evidence to charge him with 7 more murders. They also found enough evidence on 7 victims that were cremated. This brought his total number of victims to 15. The 7 that were exhumed, the 7 that were cremated, and Kathleen Grundy. Harold Shipman was now charged with 15 counts of murder. His trial began on October 5th of 1999. He pled not guilty to all 15 counts. On January 31st of 2000, he was convicted of all 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 life terms in prison. Following his trial, Harold Shipman's medical license was suspended. Thank God. It would be pretty awkward if they didn't do that. His name was also erased from all medical registers. By the time Harold Shipman's murder trial began, police and investigators investigated 23 more cases. They found that in every single one of them, they had enough evidence to charge him with murder. Once Harold was charged with the first 15 counts of murder, they didn't bring any other charges on for the other 23 counts. It really would have been just a waste of money to do it because he already received 15 life sentences. However, they did make it public that these 23 people were also killed by Harold Shipman. They wanted to do justice for the victims, to let their loved ones know that they were investigating it. They were doing everything that they could to figure out if their loved one really died of natural causes or if Harold Shipman was behind it. They also thought that it was pretty much impossible for Harold Shipman to receive a fair trial because the media got a hold of this story and it was basically headline news for the last 3 or 4 months. There wasn't a single person in the area that didn't know about this. So getting a fair trial was pretty much impossible. Due to the amount of publicity that this trial was getting, there were so many families that came forward that thought that their loved one was killed by Harold as well. Every single one of these was investigated fully, and the majority of them were true, unfortunately. By 2001, investigators had looked through 192 deaths, and they still weren't done. There were family members that continued to come forward and express concerns that their loved one was killed by Harold Shipman. Again, most of it was true. It's heartbreaking to think that your loved one was killed well before their time. Investigators continued to look through every single patient that Harold Shipman had seen, and they actually determined that he started killing at his very first job. The killings also continued into the Donnybrook Medical Center. So there wasn't a single time of Harold Shipman's medical career that he wasn't killing patients. An inmate at the Wakefield Correctional Facility actually came forward and stated that Harold Shipman confessed to killing 508 people. As a result of those claims, this obviously just widened the investigation even more. Again, these investigators wanted to get to every single patient that Harold Shipman saw because they wanted to give closure to all of these family members. Investigators concluded that Harold Shipman most likely killed 250 people starting in 1971. While the majority of his victims were elderly people, there is a very high suspicion that he may have killed a 4-year-old at a pediatric center at his first job. The investigators rejected the claim that he had killed 508 people, and they are pretty confident that the number is right around 250. Harold Shipman died in the Wakefield prison on January 13th, 2004. That is my sad, sad story of Harold Shipman, AKA Dr. Death. And here's a break from your sponsors. Guys, I have no sponsors, but subscribe to my page. Cheers, everybody. Christmas in August. Bye, everybody. It later came out that some of his relationships at that medical center were actually deteriorating. Local health authority David's knowing that the witnesses didn't have However, once Harold was charged with the first 13, that's a good number. Well, might as well keep it going. Comment and like this video. Please subscribe to the Murder Monologue page. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.